right? Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of MTCC Caribbean, we would thank each and every one of you for joining in with us for our Webinar Wednesday series. Today's theme, the inclusion of domestic maritime emissions under nationally determined contributions, the NDCs of Caribbean nations. This follows from our previous discussions on firstly, the promotion of the ratification and implementation of MARPOL Annex 6, and secondly, the implementation, monitoring, reporting, and verification of sulfur compliance, which we have previously completed. Today, we will be hearing from experts within the sector discussing varying aspects of the inclusion of maritime emissions within the NDCs of the Caribbean nations. So without further ado, I would like to share a couple points for today's session. To facilitate our smooth participation, please kindly pay attention to the following important information. The microphones of all the participants will be muted upon your entry into the webinar. Please place any of your questions in the Zoom chat and we will address them during the panel discussions. We ask that you have your full name on the platform when you're logging in. Should your internet connection become unstable, Zoom will automatically attempt to reconnect you. If you are having any further trouble logging back in, please send us an email to our technical secretariat. Please note our webinar series will be recorded and available via our website. And again, a gentle reminder that we will be taking a picture at the end of the webinar series. So please feel free to put on your cameras coming down to the end of the session to facilitate this. And last but not least, please feel free to share your ideas, your suggestions, your questions, and your comments during the series. Thank you for your attention. We look forward to your engagement to make this webinar a success. Starting off our proceedings today, we are grateful to have with us our presenter number one, Mr. Carlos Fuller, the International and Regional Liaison Officer for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Mr. Carlos Fuller is a Regional and International Liaison Officer at the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. His primary responsibility is to coordinate member states in the international climate change negotiations. He is presently the Chief Negotiator on Climate Change for the Alliance of Small Island States under the chairmanship of Belize. He is a member of the WMO Standing Committee on the Climate Services and serves on the Climate Policy Subcommittee of its Climate Coordination Panel. We welcome Mr. Fuller to discuss incorporating sector-specific initiatives in the nationally determined contributions. Welcome, Mr. Fuller.
Thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation to present. Can you see my screen?
No, not yet.
Ooh, what have I done? Share screen.
Yes, we are seeing.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. So I would just like to do a brief introduction about the NDCs, how we got there, and what the CARICOM countries are doing with their NDCs. So first, in Warsaw in 2013, the Conference of the Parties, which is a supreme organ of the Climate Change Convention, decided to adopt a new legal instrument by COP21 in December 2015, and that for that new decision, that new instrument would come into effect in 2020. It also, at the same time, in a subparagraph B of that decision, invited all countries to prepare their intended nationally determined contributions and to communicate them before the COP21. And these and the INDCs were really what each country would do to address climate change. CARICOM countries did position on INDCs were that they should be primarily to address mitigation. That is to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases to a level that would limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, as we recognize that that would be the level in which we could, our ecosystems could survive. During those negotiations, the CARICOM member states also floated the idea of actually submitting a regional INDC as opposed to country-specific ones. However, that never gained any traction. Interestingly, other developing countries' position became that INDC should also address adaptation. So at COP21 in Paris in 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted. Parties had submitted their INDCs, and an interesting objective of the Paris Agreement in its Article 2.b was that it should limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. However, when we looked at the aggregate effect of the INDCs that had already been submitted, in fact, they were limiting warming closer to 3 degrees Celsius as opposed to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Noting that the Conference of the Parties in the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement noted that the aggregate emission levels were in fact not within the 2 degree scenario, and much greater efforts would be required to limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5, and in fact, the level would be identified in a special report that was referred to in paragraph 21 of that same decision. That paragraph invited the IPCC to prepare a special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 and to contain emission pathways that would lead us to 1.5 degrees target. It also invited parties to communicate their NDCs now, not their INDCs, but their NDCs. However, it did note that countries who had submitted an INDC and did not wish to change it, that INDC would become their first NDC. Two other important paragraphs in that decision requested parties whose INDCs ended in 2025 should communicate a new NDC by 2020 and to do so every 5 years. And those countries that had submitted an INDC that ended in 2030 to communicate or update by 2020 those NDCs and to do so again every 5 years. So we are now into a 5-year cycle of submitting NDCs. CARICOM states all submitted their INDCs on time. Those INDCs, no one's changed it, and so their INDCs became their NDCs. And all the NDCs addressed mitigation, but many, if not all, also spoke about adaptation. An update, Suriname and Jamaica have now submitted their new NDCs in accordance with that decision for new NDCs to come in 2020. Belize, Grenada, and St. Lucia have formally announced that their new NDCs will be coming in by the end of the year, and all the other CARICOM member states are working on their new NDCs, which are likely to come in before the first half of next year. Now, what do the NDCs, what do we mean about emission reductions? What are the gases that are involved? There are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and sulfur hexafluorine in general. The sectors that are addressed are energy, industrial processes and the use of products, waste, agriculture, land use change, and forestry. And within many of these sectors, we have subsectors. So in energy, for example, there is the energy production subsector, which deals with production of energy through the burning of petroleum or biofuels. And in the use of energy for electricity generation, transportation, heating. A brief outlook of what the CARICOM NDCs speak about. In Antigua and Barbuda, they speak about the use of renewable energy for production of distribution of water, health services, food, emergency management, and energy efficiency standards for vehicles and appliances. In the Bahamas, it's renewable energy for electricity production and efficiency standards for transport and infrastructure. In Barbados, many more sectors, renewable energy, energy efficiency, transport, waste to energy conversion, land use change and forestry, and an interesting sector, tourism through the Chinakt project. In Belize, because of the larger land and forestry is much bigger. The use of fuel, of wood for fuels, transportation, energy efficiency and waste. In Dominica, energy, transport, manufacturing and construction, and a slew of others, very small, commercial, residential uses, agriculture, forestry, and waste to energy. In Grenada, electricity, transport, waste and forestry. Guyana, similar to Belize, lots of forestry, so that's big there, and energy. Jamaica, the first one was energy, but their new NDC includes a lot now of forestry, I think about 20% reduction in the forestry sector. And in St. Kitts and Nevis, electricity and transport. In St. Lucia is energy production and energy guidelines for buildings, appliances, and water distribution, transport efficiency and public transport. And in the new NDC, they will include forestry if they have the data. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, basically all the sectors, renewable energy, energy efficiency, transport, land use change and forestry, agriculture, waste, industrial processes, and product use. And then finally in Suriname, again, large landmass, forestry and renewable energy. And Trinidad and Tobago, interestingly, very specific, public transportation, power generation, and industry. Finally, I want to look at how we can approach these at the sectorial level. So for example, looking at Barbados's one when they speak about the Chenac project, and in particular, because that was under a tourism project, you look at the building envelope, the design of your hotels and other tourism infrastructure, but any buildings could be done, weatherproofing them so that there's no leakage of your air conditioning systems, insulation to ensure that the structure can keep in its, the cooling, but also keep out the heat, efficient lighting, renewable energy for lighting, solar water heaters, an efficient cooling system, your air conditioning systems, but also changing the coolant in your cooling system to adhere to the Kigali Amendment, and efficient utilities, how you're using water and so on. In the transport, as you're moving a tourist around by land, can you make it more efficient? Also over water, and your tourism attractions, can they also be more efficient in the use of energy and other resources? In food production, the IPCC report on land notes that we can attribute some 60% of emissions to the entire food production cycle. So behind your farm fence, in your agricultural practices, the tilling of the soil, your application of fertilizers, as your use of energy for irrigation, mechanized farming. Once you have harvested your farm products, how you're storing them, how you're drying your grains, and also you speak about mitigation there. In the transportation from the farm to the storage facility, but then even after the farm, then sending it out domestically and internationally, how you're processing and packaging the food products, how you're distributing in the supermarkets, and then finally, when you get it at home, how you're preparing your food, what kind of utensils you're using in the preparation of food. So these are sectors in which we can see how many ways we can address mitigation in our various sectors. So with them, Madam Chair, I have concluded my presentation and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
We wish to thank Mr. Fuller for his presentation, giving us an insight into the requirements on the various sectors included within the NDCs of the various countries, and undoubtedly setting a great foundation for our session. So moving along, we will now be hearing from our presenter, our very own, Mr. Stefan Nannan, the Greenhouse Gas Advisor for MTCC Caribbean. So Mr. Stefan Nannan is a senior instructor at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, who holds 18 years combined teaching and research experience at the university and at the University of the West Indies. With a BSc in physics and minors in environmental science, physics and material science, he progressed to complete his MSc in environmental science and management. His key focus is with respect to renewable energies, but he has an interest in reducing energy consumption and pollution associated with all methods of transportation. Through the recognition of his work with the MTCC Caribbean as the GHG advisor, Mr. Nannan was added to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate the UNFCCC roster of experts by Trinidad and Tobago National Focal Point, the head of multilateral environmental agreements at the Ministry of Planning and Development. This allowed for the completion of an IPCC guideline training program, resulted in Mr. Nannan being certified by the UNFCCC Secretariat and the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. This verifies his expertise in the IPCC guidelines and enhances his skills to respond to the requirements emerging from the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Welcome, Mr. Nannan, and we look forward to your discussion on the inclusion of the maritime initiatives in the NDCs of the Caribbean nations.
Thank you, Suzette. Thank you, Mr. Fuller, for the overview. Everyone see my slide, right?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, great. So what we will look at in this presentation, I want to have a look at the inclusion of maritime initiatives in the NDCs of the Caribbean nations. And what the presentation will do, we will have a look at where we are globally, where we are as a region, and the reasons for this drive to include maritime specific emission reduction targets in the countries of the countries' NDCs. So let's jump right into it. What we're seeing here is their global fossil fuel CO2 emissions by sector. So these are the global figures illustrated on the screen here. And what is included is all of the anthropogenic activities, and with the exception of land use change and forestry, and the large-scale burning of biomass. And what we notice is there is a continuous increase from 22.68 gigatons in 1990 to 37.69 gigatons in 2018 to 38.012 gigatons in 2019, showing the global CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use have not yet peaked. Despite scientific warning and political commitments, there continue to be an increase in the emissions and the use of fossil fuels. The largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions after the power industry is that of transportation. Transportation accounts for approximately 22 to 26% of all fossil fuel emissions. And this is our direct reliance on the internal combustion engine, which mainly produce carbon dioxide as one of its byproducts. And transportation will include all emissions from planes, trains, automobiles, buses, trucks, and ships. And we should note here also that more than 50% of the industry emissions, transportation industry emissions, comes from private vehicles. So as Mr. Fuller mentioned, and he touched on the Paris Agreement, and we know the Paris Agreement goals in recognizing this threat that we face. The Paris Agreement goals is to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by keeping the global temperatures rise well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and every effort to pursue an even further decrease of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as he mentioned, the main instruments in doing this is to allow the parties to decide their own nationally determined contributions, outlining the sectors with which they can reduce GHG emissions through domestic policy. It is a progressive approach where efforts should be magnified or increased, right, or become more ambitious in reverse and revised NDCs every 5 years. We must note, however, that in current conditions, current commitments expressed in the NDCs are inadequate to bridge the gap, right? He spoke and he mentioned that we are on track for 3.2 degrees Celsius rise. And this could undoubtedly lead to catastrophic events or even fatal events for small island developing states. So the emission gaps is quite large. In 2030, to achieve 2 degrees Celsius annual, 2 degrees Celsius goal, the annual emissions need to be about 15 gigatons CO2 equivalent lower than the current unconditional NDCs imply, and 32 gigatons of CO2 equivalent lower for the 1.5 goal to be realized. What this requires, and this is basically putting it into context, we just provided, I just showed you all that the CO2 emissions from fossil fuels in 2019 had emissions of approximately 38 gigatons. So in context, what we're looking at is a reduction of basically the global emissions for a year in order to achieve this target. So what we know that is required is a dramatic strengthening of the NDCs is needed, right? Countries must increase their NDC ambitions threefold to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius goal, and more than fivefold to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. For the maritime sector, there's always a bit, and still in some areas, there's still a bit of confusion as to how the emissions from international shipping are regulated. While the Kyoto Protocol explicitly provides a role for the UN agency, the IMO, the Paris Agreement does not specifically mention this point. However, what the Paris Agreement stresses on and mentions is a call for the adoption of economy-wide emissions reduction. So what is clear, and there's no doubt in it, is that emissions from this sector must be regulated with a view to fully decarbonize it if the goals of the Paris Agreements are to be met. Just to mention that the IMO initial GHG reduction strategy, in line with meeting these targets, is aiming for a 40% reduction in emissions from international shipping by 2030 and a 70% reduction by 2050. All right, so what we're going to look at here now is how the countries basically determine and report their NDC, their GHG emissions. And this is done through the 2006 IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. Energy sector, the structure category 1 of energy sector involves emissions from fuel combustion activities, fugitive emissions from fuels, and carbon dioxide transportation and storage. Subsection 1A, fuel combustion activities, is further broken down to energy industries, manufacturing industries, and construction, transportation. Other sectors are non-specified. So all the maritime transportation specific activities are illustrated on this slide. Outside of the international waterborne navigation, whose emissions must be reported as a memo item and not included in a country's national inventory, all other activities must be recorded. The emissions associated with it must be accounted for in the national inventories of the countries. And this includes domestic waterborne navigation, and that will include emissions from ships of any flag once they are their port of destination, their port of departure and destination and arrival is the same, right? Within the same territory or the same country, sorry, that is considered as waterborne domestic navigation. Offshore supply vessels, water ferries that operate within the same country, and water taxis, all of these will fall under domestic waterborne navigation. Fishing is also accounted for, and fishing could be from the ships of any flag once they are refueling within the country. And non-specified mobile waterborne component, that includes or involves emissions from vessels such as military activities or any other activities that has not been specified by the previous subsections. And that is an interesting point, especially for cruise ships. Why I've stressed on that point is because due to the advancements in data and inventory methods, the IMO's fourth GHG study was the first one to be able to produce greenhouse gas inventories that distinguish between domestic shipping and international shipping on a voyage basis. So if we notice the figures on the screen here, and I tried to display it in other methods, but still the same. The best method to show this was the tables. If we look at the figures on screen here, the change or the percentage change from the previous years for total shipping, which will include domestic and international, right? On average, over the years of the study was approximately 1.58%. For international shipping voyage-based, so this is international shipping alone voyage-based, the average percentage increase per year was 0.93. For vessel-based international figures, the average was 1.37. For domestic shipping voyage-based, the average increase was 3.62%. And for domestic shipping vessel-based, the average increase was 3.2%. So what the fourth study showed is that in using this methodology, which is in line with the IPCC guidelines and definitions, the percentage of shipping classified previously as domestic was drastically underestimated. This resulted in approximately 30% of total shipping emissions falling directly within national government's responsibility, right? Twice the number previously estimated in the third study, right? This change should prompt increased pressures for regulations of short sea shipping activities by flag states with aggressive national CO2 reduction targets. So what they have recognized is there is more responsibility and potential for shipping GHG emissions reductions within national emissions accounting that had previously been taught. Now, the voyage-based methodology, which involves voyage details, this most likely will have led to this realization as opposed to the vessel-based methodology, which look at the vessel particulars. Captain Singh will touch on the different tiers, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 methodologies approach in accounting for the emissions in his presentation. So transport has been identified as a sector of key relevance for climate change. 172 countries have identified this sector as an area of action for emissions reduction. 119 countries define mitigation actions in the sector. But if we look more specifically at the Caribbean countries' key NDC indicators, and we're looking under transportation, not many of them have specified a value, a quantified value for transport target. Antigua and Barbuda, they have not specified the target, but they have commented on approaches in reducing emissions from road transportation by 2020 through the establishment of energy efficient standards for the importation of all vehicles and appliances. Bahamas, similarly, not yet specified, but they have included an economy-wide target of 30% under the energy sector. And they have included some initiatives here, some possible initiatives, including taxation of vehicle imports tied to fuel consumption, lowered import duty on hybrid vehicles or electric cars, and measures to influence vehicle use, reduction in vehicle use, and the availability of public transit. Bahamas, similar, Barbados, sorry, not specified. They have an economy-wide target of 44%, but they have some initiatives, tax incentives to be used to encourage the adoption of alternative vehicles and fuels. Belize, they have quantified a 20% reduction in their transportation figures by 2030. And at least 20, this will be done through conventional transportation fuel and development of policy to implement a master plan to promote the energy efficiency in the transport sector. Dominica has targeted 12 gigagrams of CO2 reduction or greenhouse gas reduction, right, through the transportation sector, right? And this is expected to be prioritized by and promoted by hybrid vehicles, including changes to the government fleet and the private sector. Grenada, 20% by 2025, and again, the introduction of biofuels, gasoline, diesel taxes, and the implementation of energy efficiency standards for vehicles. Guyana, not yet specified. Haiti, 5% reduction by 2030, right? And they have given that as an unconditional NDC, which basically means they could implement it, right, without much support. Jamaica, not yet specified. Jamaica have included an overall energy sector target reduction of 10% by 2030. St. Kitts and Nevis, 5% reduction by national fuel consumption by 2020, and they intend to do this through the promotion of fuel purchases of fuel efficient vehicles. St. Lucia, not yet specified, but they have included initiatives such as transportation interventions, levies on imported vehicles, and expanded public transportation. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, approximately 10% reduction, emissions reduction over 10 years, and this is including domestic transportation. Suriname, not yet specified, but their approach is a blended fuel approach using cleaner fuels, blended ethanol blended in gasoline for 60% of vehicles. And Trinidad and Tobago has identified the transportation sector as a priority sector with a 1.7 million ton CO2 equivalent reduction, right? And this is approximately 30% of the overall 15% total target reduction by 2030. So a summary of these key NDC indicators, Caribbean key NDC indicators for transportation, the majority of the nations have not specified a transport target. Most have mentioned reduction strategies for road use, road vehicles. Some countries have stated emission reduction targets through improved public transportation, but no nation specifically mentioned emission reduction targets or transportation targets or strategies through their maritime sector. These are some nations, and these are just some examples to give by way of example. Some nations that have included maritime specific NDCs targets within their NDCs, and these include Japan, Turkey, India, Sri Lanka, Fiji, and the Marshall Islands. So just to go through some of these briefly, some of the initiatives being proposed by Japan is a reduction in land transportation by selecting nearest ports, which is essentially increasing their maritime share of the multimodal transportation network, and the use of eco-friendly ships, promotion of cleaner ships. Turkey, implementation of green ports and green airports. So we see here that the reductions doesn't necessarily have to be targeted towards shipboard machinery or shipboard improvements, but could also be done through the ports, efficiencies within the ports. India increased the domestic shipping, basically expanding the maritime, faction within their multimodal transportation. Sri Lanka introduced electrified electric boat services using the inland waterways, and the implementation of internal laws and regulations through the Ocean Shipping Secretariat. In relation to maritime emissions, the Marshall Islands also recognizes the contribution of domestic shipping and addresses this in their 2025 NDC. And this suggests a number of low carbon pathways, including changes to their ship design, right? More efficient designs, including hydrodynamically efficient hull designs, more energy efficient propulsion systems, the implementation of energy efficient operational measures, the dual fuel use, right? Use more carbon efficient fuels, and also improvements in their port operations to for quicker turnaround times. They also recognize that they are the second largest ship registry in the world, suggesting that implementing these carbon reduction strategies at home could see a ripple effect across international shipping. Fiji have a number of, they have a number of initiatives addressing maritime specific reductions. They have an NDC implementation roadmap, which involves or includes the improvement of maintenance for sea vessels, right? Implement measures to improve the fuel efficiency. They will focus on their highest fuel consuming vessels, but from commercial shipping or government shipping. They estimate an average expected GHG reduction of between 2021 and 2030 of 5,000 tons CO2 per year. The average annual or the expected total investment over the period for this initiative is approximately between 4 to 8 million US. They also recognize the issues with data collection, gathering, and sharing, right? So they call to strengthen data and information gathering, reporting, and verification, and increase compliance. So back at home, we were able to do is have a look at the overall CO2 emissions. So what is displayed on the slide is the CO2 emissions, the fossil CO2 emissions for the Caribbean territories. And what it shows is that from 1990 through 2005, 2018, 2019, is the majority of Caribbean nations, the CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use continue to increase, indicating that our use of fossil fuels have not yet peaked. What we also notice is that some countries have large percentages of this fossil fuel use attributed to transportation. So these were the total CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use for the Caribbean territory on the whole, which again shows an increase, not yet peaked, right? As opposed to the percentage of the total CO2 emissions associated with fossil fuel use. The Caribbean is responsible for approximately 0.3%. Within some of the territories, the transportation percentage is high, and it contributes significantly to the country overall GHG or CO2 emissions inventory. This means that reduction from any faction within the transportation sector could result or should result in a reduction in GHG emissions overall and should be considered within their NDCs. What we were also able to do is we got some information, some fuel consumption data from two territories, Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. Now this data continues to be difficult to access, right? Which is we will address that a bit later, but it is difficult to access. With the Guyana ferries, we were able to get a figure of using the total fuel used per year, the respective densities and carbon factors. The emissions associated with the ferries in Guyana was approximately 5,450 tons of CO2 emissions annually, or 5.5 gigagrams. This represents approximately 1.7% of Guyana's total transportation figures. This does not include the fuel used on the MV Barima, as this vessel makes international voyage between Guyana and Suriname, and it does not include emissions from domestic shipping, such as the offshore supply vessels, the fishing vessels, or the military use. For Trinidad and Tobago, we were only able to get some figures for two of the past ferries that were in use, right? So these were some of the figures from the TNT Spirit, the Express, and then the two water taxis, the Sprinter and the Trinidad Flash. The emissions from these four vessels accounted for approximately 59,000 tons of CO2 emission annually, or 58.7 gigagrams. So these ferries and the water taxis assessed account for approximately 2.36% of Trinidad and Tobago transportation figures. Not included here are, well, currently we have 3 vessels running the inter-island ferries. This only accounts for 2, the Cabo Star, the Jardin de la Opet, and the Galleon's Passage. And it also does not include the offshore supply vessels that operate in Trinidad and Tobago waters, the propulsion of drill ships, the propulsion of FPSOs or fishing vessels. So if this represents 2.36%, taking into account the other domestic shipping, we are sure that Trinidad and Tobago domestic shipping could account for over 7% of TNT's transportation figures. Again, reductions in the maritime industry, as Trinidad and Tobago looks for a 30% reduction from transportation. Reductions within maritime could prove to be significant in helping Trinidad and Tobago achieve this goal or be used for our more ambitious NDCs as we continue to up the ambition. But what I want to look at now is, are we selling dreams? Is this possible? Is it possible to reduce these emissions, right? What we have presented here is an electric ferry, right? The LN that operates domestically within Denmark. It was an EU Horizon 2020 project, and it runs approximately 22 nautical miles between charges. And this includes power for her normal operations and emergencies. She could take approximately 30 vehicles and 200 passengers and reduces emissions by more than 70%. Now this emission reduction figure depends on how these ferries are being charged, whether the power is being derived from fossil fuels or not. A country such as Guyana, where the ferry voyages are, some of the ferry voyages are shorter than this 22 nautical miles. And Guyana with hydroelectric power, the reduction in implementing such measures could prove to be high, greater than 70% reduction by operating these ferries. And the goal of the industry must be to operate on 100% renewable energies for the sector to strive and become a sustainable sector. Another approach, apart from reducing emissions directly on ship machinery or propulsion, what we could do is we could look at expanding the maritime faction of the multimodal transportation. So introducing or incorporating more short sea shipping among the islands could also help in reducing the GHG emissions associated with the transportation sector. If we look at medium vehicles as opposed to ferry grams per passenger kilometer, you will see there's almost a 10 times, right? 10 times or tenfold the emissions associated with medium car transportation as opposed to ferry transportation. All right. Some other initiatives that are on the way, and this includes some of the maritime initiatives, the links to NDCs. This includes some initiatives being implemented by our sister MTCC, MTCC Pacific, where their pilot project basically deals with implementing ship energy efficiency management plans for various vessels on their domestic fleet. So they are assisting Fiji in implementing some of their measures. As I mentioned before, it does not only have to be on the ship side. Improvements could be made on the port side, where they implemented just upgrading LED lighting in the port of Sova, right? They were able to realize a reduction of 32 tons of GHG emissions annually. Other maritime initiatives, again, ports, right? A number of ports base financial incentives to mitigate GHG emissions. And some of these are already in place. The most common is a financial incentive used in the environmentally differentiated port fee, right? This applies to approximately 28 of the 100 largest international ports and takes a form of reduction of port fees for ships that are considered environmentally friendly, right? Usually based on an index related to a ship characteristic. And in some US ports, there are financial incentives for ships reducing speed when approaching the port. The Panama Canal Authority has a scheme that provides priority slot allocation for greener ships. But we know there are some challenges in trying to incorporate the NDCs, the maritime NDCs, within the country's NDCs, right? And these include the lack of tangible data for high-level ambition targets. So what tends to happen is the estimates of mitigation potential tend to be a bit conservative. As we have seen in the two examples that I showed you, those tend to be conservative without the adequate data, right, to better inform. Buy-in from key transport stakeholders, including the agencies such as the Maritime Administration, the ship owners and the operators, and also connecting sector-specific strategies to the NDCs. There's also the majority of regional maritime administrations we have interacted with over the last 4 years. They're also, the majority of them have indicated a need for capacity building, and some may not have available environmental experts, right, within their administrations. So the recommendations for the Caribbean, some recommendations, right, for domestic shipping locally or regionally, we could look to incorporate more shipping, less emissions, include shipping where possible, and the multimodal transportation of freight. Green ports, starting with more efficient, energy efficient lighting systems and port equipment. More cooperation between the maritime administration, stakeholders, and planning and environmental ministries. Increasing maritime sector ambition in the revised NDCs, and strengthening the fuel consumption and GHG emissions data collection, leading for better informed decisions. So before we close off this session, what I would like to do is propose a timeline for the inclusion of these specific maritime energy reduction targets into the NDCs of the Caribbean nations. So what I will do, I'll put the timeline and we go through it, give you all a bit of time to reflect on it. We have two very experienced persons involved in NDC implementation within the Caribbean territory, where we could involve in the discussions this afternoon, where we will look at identifying the challenges, right, and how we could overcome some of these challenges in getting maritime specific emission reduction targets included in the country's NDCs. So these are some figures we discussed and some times that we discussed, and just jot down, and again, this is up for discussion. If by June 2021, next year, 6 months, authorities collecting data concerning maritime fuels can be identified, and these fuel figures feed to the maritime authorities. By December 2021, authorities responsible for the NDC formulation and implementation identified, and a relationship between the maritime authority or the industry established, and discussions on the potential of emission reductions to the sector begins. March 2022, the collected data can be used to make more informed decisions on the policies for these emission reduction targets in the sector. And by June 2022, specific maritime emission reduction targets included in the country's NDCs for the next communication. So these are just some thoughts that we put down, right? Some timelines, and we want to hear your views on it as when we start the discussion. But what is also important to note in closing is that it is important because the better elaborated our NDC is, it is more prepared a country will be to implement it. And preparedness for the NDC implementation is one important indicator of a country's ability to access international support for climate change mitigation actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for your insightful contributions to our discussion today. where you outline the sectors incorporated within the NDCs. You highlighted these targets set by the countries, and you also gave us some of the challenges that are faced by the countries attempting to include the maritime emissions within the NDCs. But as Stefan also reminded me today of the saying, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. Here we have with us to provide further insight into the need for proper fuel accounting in producing an efficient GHG emissions inventory is also our very own Captain Sukjit Singh. Captain Singh is a master mariner and a practitioner turned academic with over 24 years in the shipping industry and maritime sector. He is the assistant professor of the Center for Maritime and Ocean Studies at the UTT and the overall program leader for maritime programs. Buoyed by his master's in international management for oil and gas and his postgraduate diploma in maritime energy management, he's actively involved in applied research in energy and safety management systems within the maritime domain, seeking to provide innovative solutions and mitigating emissions from ships and ports. As a nominated expert on the UNFCCC roster of technical experts for the review of biennial reports and national communications for parties, he's also a member of the expert review team, which conducted the technical review of the 4 reports of Austria, Canada, France, Greece, Ireland, and Spain. He is also our Deputy Director and Technical Head of the Maritime Technology Cooperation Center for the Caribbean. So I welcome Captain Singh. We look forward to your presentation on accounting for maritime bunker fuels.
Thank you, Suzette, and good afternoon, everyone. Just a thumbs up, you can hear me loud and clear, and you can see my screen. Okay, thank you so much. So, as we already discussed, Stefan provided us some context as to inclusion of maritime emissions within the NDCs, but it is important for us to see how we are measuring those. So, UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Kyoto Protocol, it called for GHG emissions from fuels used for both international aviation and maritime transportation, which is maritime bunker fuels, to be accounted for and reduced through the initiatives of International Civil Aviation Organization for aviation and IMO, International Maritime Organizations, with respect to maritime emissions. However, at the same time, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change guidelines require preparation of GHG inventories, that emissions from international aviation and maritime transport, including international bunker fuel emissions, be calculated as part of national GHG inventories of the parties, but should be excluded from national totals and reported separately as memo items. This is due to the nature of shipping. As we all know, where a vessel plying trade for a particular country may not be registered to that country's registry or flag, as we commonly know. So the emissions for the vessels will be accounted in such a case where it is registered to whatever flag. So those emissions are usually accounted by the flag state of the vessel. So if we see our focus is on the waterborne navigation, both international and domestic. So to understand this categorization better, it was briefly touched by Stefan. So we'll go a little more detail and see, okay, how the bunker fuel ends up on vessel, what is the consumption stage. So whether the fuel is consumed while the vessel is in port, basically we're looking at an energy source, and then where that energy is being consumed for the purpose of inventory and accounting. So vessel while in port, it consumes fuel while alongside or maneuvering, and then it sets up a voyage. Now, so to have a clear split for the accounting purposes, the split of domestic and international is determined on the basis of port of departure and port of arrival, and not by the flag or nationality of the ship for the purpose of IPCC inventories. So if we look at international marine bunker fuel with that perspective, the international marine bunker fuel is therefore fuel quantities delivered to ships of all flags that are engaged in international navigation. The international navigation may take place at sea or inland lakes or waterways, coastal waters, anywhere. But the qualifying criteria is where the two ports are in different countries. When we are looking at international marine bunker fuel, so consumptions by ships engaged in domestic navigation is excluded. Also, the consumption by fishing vessels and by military forces is also excluded, which is actually included in residential services and agriculture for fishing vessels. Now, the second category of where the vessel is doing voyage to domestic port, so domestic navigation fuel is for the domestic shipping, the shipping between the ports of the same country, and as opposed to international shipping, which we just discussed. So domestic shipping excludes same. Domestic also does not include for the purpose of reporting military and fishing. As I just explained, they are in a separate category. So by this definition, the same ship may frequently be engaged in both international and domestic shipping operations, because depending upon the nature of voyage. We will look a little more detail into that when we go into the specification of tiers. So recapturing on it, so domestic navigation fuel is fuel delivered to vessels of all flags not engaged in international navigation, right? And this will include even voyages of considerable length between two ports in the same country. Okay, so for example, like our ferries in Trinidad here, they make about 96 nautical miles distance. So all that is covered within domestic, as long as both the ports are in the same country. Fishing fuel is used for all type of fishing, inland, coastal, or deep sea fishing. It covers fuel delivered to ships of all flags that have refueled in the country, including international fishing, and as well as energy used in fishing industry. So it is included with agriculture and forestry under other categories. So it's important now to look at different methods which can be used to estimate these emissions or removals from the most source categories. So the selection of particular method will depend on the desired degree of estimation detail, the availability of activity data, and obviously the emission factors, the required financial and human resources available to complete the inventory. So in IPCC terminology, we have 3 tiers. The lowest ranking or simplest method is tier 1, while the more elaborate methods are tier 2 and tier 3. So tier 1 method typically utilizes default emission factors given by IPCC, and it requires the most basic and least disaggregated activity data. The tier 1 emission factors assume an average technology for the fleet, and it is also based on the premise that quantities of fuel sold for shipping activities are available by fuel type from nationally collected data. So basically, the main importance is the quantity and the type of the fuel. Tier 1 approach uses, as I already said, the emission factors for each pollutant for each type of fuel used. Tier 2 methodology, also known as technology specific approach, utilizes engine and fuel specific emission factors. So tier 2 approach is based on the total fuel split, again between based on national or domestic navigation and international shipping bunkers. But in order to apply the more detailed emission factors, we need more data like port arrival statistics. They need to be aggregated, then split by the engine type, and the average factors for fuel type and ship activity. So the data required for tier 2 inventory is more compared to tier 1. And if we see both tier 1 and tier 2 approaches, they use fuel sales as the primary activity indicator and assume that average vessel emission characteristics are assumed basically to calculate the emission estimates. Whereas when we go to the more advanced tier 3, which is based on ship movement, as we know that tier 3 is, we can call it ship movement methodology, and thus it requires ship movement information for individual ship. It's more detailed. So the ship movement methodology is recommended when detailed ship movement data is available, as well as technical information on each ship is also available. For example, the engine size, the technology available on board, power installed or fuel use, the amount of time spent in different activities like maneuvering or at anchor, idling, loaded voyage, and all that. So all that data is, when it is available, the tier 3 can only be performed that time. It is suited for estimating, as we said, the both domestic and international emissions, as long as we have the data required available. The challenge is this methodology of tier 3 may be quite time consuming to perform. And for commercial vessels, the tier 3 approach calculates the emission based on summing up the emissions on a trip by trip basis. And this is something again very in line with the DCS implemented by IMO, where the ships are making daily log of fuel consumed and the activity involved. So that is to get the highest detail of the inventory or the fuel consumed in different activities on board vessels. Now, looking at this, looking at the slide, we realize also that higher tiers usually utilize more elaborate methods and very source specific or technology specific. Or if we look at the geographical scope of it, maybe more region specific or country specific factors, again, which are based on the measurements and normally require more highly disaggregated activity data. Tier 2 and 3 methods require more detailed and obviously also the measurement for their application. It is also important to note that in order to meet the general reporting criteria for the country as a whole under the requirements, now a country must subsequently make a fuel adjustments in other relevant fuel consuming sectors. It is important to, because in order to maintain the grand national energy balance, right? So these methodologies may be used to calculate the emissions following the definitions of domestic and international, or some other definitions if we want to look at the geographical area or anything, but the methodologies remain the same for calculation of emission inventories. Here is a brief detail, because now when we understand that in order to obtain the most precise estimates for navigation, parties are encouraged to carry out tier 3 or bottom-up calculations. But this will require detailed bottom-up fuel consumption and emission calculations, right? So for individual segments, and the detailed tier 3 approach therefore requires statistical data which may not be available by the reporting party or the country which is preparing the inventory, right? So therefore, the basic concept when making decisions on selection of which tier to use or what should be the approach, those will be, if the detailed information is available, then use it as much as possible, right? So it means we can use tier 1 or 2 or tier 3. And if the source category is the key source, that is, then a tier 2 or 3 method must be used for estimating the emissions, right? But in all cases, emission needs to be split on domestic and international and fishing and military, which are usually determined by the available statistics, right? So it still need to be categorized on along those categories as we discussed earlier. Now, tier 2 will require data on the, in addition, because tier 2 needs little more detail. So we will need data on statistical port arrivals, the data by type of vessels, which vessels visited, what is the total power installed for each type of vessel by the engine speed and fuel class, total power installed by, the engine type, all assumptions that fuel usage is proportional to power installed, again, is important, right? So this assumption is there that fuel usage is proportional to the power installed to assign statistical fuel consumption to different engine speed and fuel class. Now, the latest study, which was briefly touched by Stefan, is the 4th IMO GHG study. They chose to apply 2 allocation methods. Option 1 was vessel-based allocation, and it was same as was used in 3rd IMO GHG study in 2014. And option 2 was also used, which used voyage-based allocation. So basically, according to vessel-specific voyage intelligence, and that is where if we compare the 2 options. Option 1 allows for easy comparison and consistency because it is vessel based, and whereas option 2, which incorporates voyage based allocation, it incorporates the advances due to AIS technology, because we know where the vessel is arriving from, where it is going, and it reduces the gap between the modeled and observed data by applying the IPCC definition of international and domestic shipping, which we just discussed, right? Now, given the practical difficulties with using the above methodologies, a simpler top-down or as we say tier 1 approach has been attempted in past by many parties, and this approach rely on basically estimates such as fuel consumption and vessel type combined with estimated emission figures. So the top-down approach is independent of any ship specification such as engine type or type engine type, and then it's just basically the type and quantity of fuel which is being consumed, right? So this approach basically utilizes the national bunker fuel data over a period or a reporting period, and then emissions are then calculated using internationally accepted emission factors. The method accuracy is dependent on the quality of the country's bunker fuel data, right? So, and this is what we'll look in further, as we move forward in the presentation. So given this method, it basically requires the country's bunker fuel data. So this is less complex compared to the activity data capture required for tier 3 or tier 2. So it is recommended as the first approach to estimate emissions from shipping, especially domestic shipping, right? And also this basic one important aspect of inventories is also the comparison of emissions using alternative approaches. This is also an important aspect of verification. So as discussed earlier, the reference approach, which is tier 1, it estimates CO2 from fuel combustion. So therefore this approach can be performed quickly, provide the basic balance sheet for countries, energy balance sheet for which for a country is available very quickly. Reference approach also provides a potential useful way of cross-checking emissions with those calculated using the other approaches, right? And thus helps to identify if there are any inconsistencies or mistakes. So those are the another advantage of the reference approach. Now, this takes us to look at a quick look, because if we are looking at the reference approach or tier 1, this takes us to maritime bunker supply chain and importance of identifying the nodes, I would say. Means I like to call them the data nodes, which can assist in data collection on movement of the bunker among various categories to prevent the actual allocation to the correct category. So a standard maritime bunker chain would include where a fuel is coming, either it is imported or coming directly from refinery. Depending on the type of the fuel or quality of the fuel, it may need blending and then goes to a storage. It can be used locally, again along the same line, domestic, international, or non-maritime use, or it is exported directly. So then it does not account for the inventory. It is, so needs to be an account of the exported fuel, which is going directly either offshore bunkering or exported to the other country. So we can look specifically now, because while doing this, I was looking at Trinidad and Tobago. We don't have the refinery anymore, so I took that out of it. So the fuel we are receiving in case of Trinidad and Tobago is all imported, and we know that it is going either directly the grade or type required, or it is blended and prepared for that. And then storage takes us to the same what we discussed earlier. So either it is exported directly, so there needs to be an account of what is being exported and going to either it is going as a cargo or it is going as a bunker or a fuel are another considerations when it is exported. And then the fuel also, which is for local supply, so whether it is going to international bunkering or domestic. And then again, if it is going directly from the importer, or it is going via local trader, and there may be an allocation within there which might be going to non-maritime use. So it is important to identify all these categories and look at the data, how fuel is moving, to have an accurate inventory even for the reference approach. So if you look at this, I mean, these are the same, this is the same supply chain, but some identified nodes to collect the data. And certainly, as you will see on the slide, a lot of this data is existing. It is not that this data needs to be captured. This data is being captured by various authorities or the stakeholders which are involved in the business. The idea is to have them at some common place where a proper account can be made and it can be used to produce a more accurate inventory. So right, again, as the the bunker is moving, depending upon again the grade type and the category, because again, remember, this is not only used as a bunker. Maybe this is some ships may be bringing it in now when the consignment is coming, whether it is being allocated to bunker or it is allocated as a cargo is also we need to differentiate that when it comes. So this is again important, the actual quantity and grades transferred to use, right, and actual quantity and grades transferred to international bunker or domestic bunker, or it is reported to export or for non-maritime use. So these may be available from customs or Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries, as we see. So if we have these data existing, it is existing, and then all we need is to connect it to a common platform for the purpose of inventory, where we see that we have a centralized data management system where all this data can be fed into, and then all the challenges, as we will see in the next slide, some of the challenges can be overcome when we are using this centralized data management system. And I'm hopeful in the next presentation from Mr. Keishan Kumar Singh, we will see a little bit about MRV system. So if we can incorporate that, so this accurate inventory mechanism is possible within there. So the challenges, because okay, all this seems is very easily done, but then there are challenges because maritime sector reporting, it needs to distinguish between, as I said, between the international and domestic navigation categories, and there is a lot of uncertainty in that. Also the cargo and the bunker distribution, right, the distinguishing between them. So errors can be made when fuels reported under different categories are combined. And this type of error can be split in two cases, as we can say, either misallocations or duplications, right? So misallocations are basically fuels that should be attributed to domestic are allocated in international, or vice versa. And in the case of the same allocation is uncertain. However, what will happen in this case, the categories will be different, but the total emissions may be correct. The total fuel is type or the quantity is correct, but the allocation of categories or the emissions allocated to each category will not be correct. There can be additional challenges in distinguishing between domestic and international, and each country's data source is unique, and it is not possible to formulate a general rule regarding how to make an assignment. And this is why, again, important to study the maritime supply, bunker supply chain, respective to the territory, that what is working in each territory and which data nodes will be relevant to that inventory. The other challenge is duplication, where fuel sale is allocated in both categories, leading to double counting of the amount of fuel sold. So in this case, what will happen? Duplication. The allocation and fuel totals can contain errors contributing to high uncertainty. Data accuracy, it can suffer a lack of intrinsic accuracy because of the ways in which the data is collected and reported. A simple example, a lot of companies are still using manual gauging to see the amount of cargo being transferred, or what is the condition of flow meters, the quality control over how the volume or the quantity is being measured. So all that can contribute to the data accuracy. The sector misallocations, yes, marine fuels might be allocated to other non-shipping categories. For example, the best example is export, right, where fuel is imported and exported, but it is not used. And so if there is a similar to sector misallocation, that can lead to over-reporting or under-reporting for the category. And last but not the least is the transfer category reporting. So this comprises inter-product transfers, which can result from reclassification of products, right? So for example, a local trader buys a fuel from the importer, and then it is used for non-maritime use, but how it is ending up there, whether it was purchased under maritime bunker. So there is a complexity within the reclassification of the category, and this is again required. And certainly the net balance of inter-product transfers should be zero, because we know that, okay, if this is taken from here, so it is going from which sector to which, and then which category to what next category, and national stocks can be used also for blending route, right? For example, whether when you are blending fuel, then again two types of fuel is being mixed. So you have to be clear that how this reallocation happens. And this could increase the volume of fuel delivered to ships sometimes without statistical documentation and resulting in underreporting, right? So those are the challenges. Now, I will go back how we started. This is my last slide. As highlighted by our moderator in the beginning, and when Sukjit said that if we cannot measure it, we cannot manage it, or I should say we cannot improve it if we cannot measure it, right? So an accurate and complete inventory is first step in that direction. And these are the some important ingredients of or the constituents of sustainable maritime transport. And one of the important when we are looking from the perspective, right? So we should not forget that ultimate objective is of achieving sustainable maritime transport, or when we are looking at the global level, is to achieve a stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations within the atmosphere, maybe to a level that would prevent dangerous interference with the climate system, basically. And most importantly, such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystem to adapt naturally to climate change, and to enable at the same time on the side enable the economic developments to proceed in a sustainable manner. So therefore, GHG inventories are in a sense meant to underpin and substantiate the climate mitigation and adaptation efforts by the parties, right? So this is a starting line. I mean, we need to do it with a certain degree of accuracy, and this is where you will see that now that the uncertainty assessment, the completeness, the data accuracy, the transparency are important elements of these inventories, right? And data sharing is key when it comes to verify the activity data and its relevance to the category, right? So trust is an important consideration when we are looking into the sustainable maritime transport, where we can share this data in a very complete and transparent manner, right? And the completeness of data also allows for comparison of emissions using alternative approaches. So these are some I call them software components of having solid inventories. So this is key. And that being said, thank you very much for your attention, and feel free to reach out to any one of us for any further discussion in relation to maritime energy management or associated emissions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Captain Singh, for your contributions in understanding the categorization of the marine fuels, assessing and calculating their emissions, and also the need for proper accounting of the fuel use, especially domestic fuel use, producing accurate GHG emission inventories. So moving on, and our final presenter for the day is going to be Mr. Keishan Kumar Singh. Mr. Keishan Kumar Singh is the head of the multilateral environmental agreements in the Ministry of Planning and Development in Trinidad and Tobago. He is and has been the country's lead negotiator for climate change under the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement for the past 22 years. He has overall responsibility for climate policy planning and coordination of its implementation. Internationally, he has chaired the subsidiary board for the scientific and technological advice under the UNFCCC, as well as co-chaired the negotiations on the Paris Agreement, during which he was also responsible for securing adoption of the decision of the NDCs, which forms the bedrock of the Paris Agreement. He currently heads a team of dedicated professionals in developing approaches to implement climate action in Trinidad and Tobago. We welcome Mr. Keishan Kumar Singh to present to us Trinidad and Tobago's nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement and the MRV system, progressing to economy-wide targets.
Thank you very much, Suzette, and good afternoon, colleagues. So my presentation really looks at how, really builds on the last three presentations by Mr. Fuller, Mr. Nannan, and Captain Singh, to illustrate basically how we are moving forward with recording some of these emissions. And I want to start with a takeoff from Captain Singh's last slide, where he said, accurate inventory is the first step, and that is precisely what the MRV system is about. So my presentation basically looks at how we develop these systems for recording emissions and how we intend to move forward with those. Are you seeing my? I'm just wondering whether you're seeing my
Yes.
my screen.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great. Right. Okay. Good. So as has been said by Carlos as well, and by Captain Singh and Mr. Nannan as well, Trinidad and Tobago's nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement has two components: a conditional component, which is dependent on receipt of support, both technical capacity and financial support, to reduce the cumulative from three sectors, the three most emitting sectors in Trinidad and Tobago, which are the power generation, industrial, and transportation sectors, by 15% relative to a business as usual baseline by 2030, which is an equivalent of 103 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in absolute terms, and an unconditional component, which is at the state's expense, to reduce public transportation emissions by 30% relative to BAU by 2030, end of 2030. And this is already underway to achieving the emissions reductions through primarily a state-funded fuel switching program to the amount of about $300 million at the moment. Trinidad and Tobago's climate change mitigation, monitoring, reporting, and verification system, or the MRV system, was therefore developed to be systematic data collection and reporting in order to track the emissions, of course, pursuant to the climate change policy that we have, and as well for looking at tracking the achievement of the nationally determined contribution. So our MRV system was developed with the primary objectives of ensuring the MRVing, if I can use that as a verb, of the greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with applicable international standards, while taking national circumstances into account, and primarily we're using the IPCC 2006 guidelines. To enable Trinidad and Tobago to track its emissions, of course, consistent with what we have to report on and account for under the NDC, as well as to pursue national policy objectives consistent with the national climate change policy. But overall, to enable Trinidad and Tobago to effectively monitor the support provided from both external and domestic sources for climate change policies and related actions. So there are two components of this. It's for monitoring and verifying emissions, but also to monitor support received in terms of technical and financial support, which we need to also report on under the Paris Agreement. Additionally, to promote greenhouse gas emissions reduction efforts and actions so that we can identify what efforts are being made, what actions are being taken, and what are some of their co-benefits. To enhance cooperation among stakeholders by identifying their roles and responsibilities, and to support stakeholders with the relevant technical information, knowledge, and guidance to implement the MRV system through what has been developed in terms of guidance documents that looks at detailed tasks and templates that require the furnishing of various types of information to keep with the principles of TACCC, as you all know them, in terms of accuracy, comprehensiveness, and consistency, and so on. So the national system, the MRV system, is really composed of two separate systems. The MRV system itself, which facilitates the collection and analysis and transparent reporting of accurate and reliable information and data on greenhouse gas emissions, what efforts are being undertaken to mitigate them, and what resources and support are devoted to efforts. And as I said before, it's supported by templates that have been designed to capture the relevant information for retrieval and the quality assurance management of the system. And the second component, the knowledge management system, which really is the database, and the central repository is composed of 3 subparts: the data and information on greenhouse gas emissions, support received, consistent with what is being reported and verified, methodologies, guidelines, standards, and protocols on how to monitor, report emission sources, and of course standardized reporting procedures and formats. So the systematic, the little diagram there outlines the systematic relationship between the various MRV components. So that if we focus now on the core areas of the knowledge management system, it consists of 3 separate parts: data, which is really information or data that is supplied by what we refer to as data suppliers, or the emitting entities, or those responsible for collecting data with respect to activity data related to greenhouse gas emissions, and which are required to support the MRV of greenhouse gas emissions, including the emissions factors that are being used. Also information reported by these entities on what mitigation efforts and the outcomes of those efforts. It also records the resources allocated to national mitigation efforts and provides broadly quality control and quality assurance checks on the data, but also has built-in security and associated permissions for stakeholders or data suppliers that may require a certain level of confidential treatment in supplying some of the data that they would be providing. It also consists of the methodological guidelines on how to monitor, how to report, and how to verify these emissions and the emission reductions, both from the public and private sector, in terms of what efforts are being made. And specifically for emissions data, it will follow the IPCC guidelines, as I said, the 2006 guidelines, while there may be other protocols being developed for data on mitigation efforts. So the reporting on emissions are fairly standard. I think Captain Singh went through, I think Mr. Nannan also had gone through a little bit on how these emissions are calculated according to standardized reporting. The KMS also provides for procedures, standardized procedures for collecting, for processing, for archiving and applying data in order to meet the reporting and verification requirements under the Paris Agreement, and as well under the national regulatory processes which we'll be developing, and I will speak to it a little bit more later in the next few slides. Because, as you know, the Paris Agreement now has an Article 13 that requires enhanced transparency, and we're now incorporating those modalities, procedures, and guidelines that have been adopted internationally under the Paris Agreement and under Article 13 specifically into the MRV system, but I will get to that a little bit later. So the procedures also include standardized reporting formats, and critically, a quality assurance and a quality control system for checking the data submitted. The key stakeholders in the MRV system include the coordinating entity, a host, a manager of the KMS, executing entities, and quality assurance working group with the following responsibilities to plan, test, implement, and manage the system, to collect and maintain checks and quality assurance of incoming data and information. And the MRV system and the KMS system is currently housed in the Environmental Management Authority, and they will assume total responsibility for managing the whole system, but also for receiving data and quality checking it as well. And I'll speak a little bit more later on how this is going to be formalized in legislation, or how it is proposed to be formalized in legislation. In respect of the executing entities, both public and private sector stakeholders are expected to report on emissions from their specific activity data, and implement and monitor and report on mitigation efforts that they are also planning to implement to reduce emissions. And there's also a role for sector experts to research relevant data sets, look at greenhouse gas emission estimation methods. As Captain Singh said earlier, there's a lot of uncertainty in some of the different data sets that are required and activity data that are being reported, particularly at the tier 1 and in the use of default emission factors as well. So the aim here is really to go to higher tiers as far as possible, so that some of these uncertainties are reduced or removed, and academia and sector experts has a responsibility to improving, for example, emission factors. The MRV system, therefore, is designed to allow stakeholders, the executing entities or the emitting entities or the data suppliers. We still have not found a name for them, but they understand the description. It will require them to calculate their own emissions using the IPCC 2006 and upload that information into the knowledge management system. Specifically within the EMA, the air unit is being trained and equipped and capacitated to perform the necessary quality assurance and quality control checks on the data before combining them towards a national inventory. I should also add that even the data suppliers or the executing entities have also been trained and are being trained in the same quality assurance and quality checks within their own inventories before submitting to the KMS. So we are catering for a double-sided quality assurance and quality control checks in submitting and managing the data before they upload it into a national registry, which we intend to make public in the interest of transparency. So the diagram at the bottom there basically outlines the various steps on how the inventory process will work within the KMS. So the data suppliers, those who require confidential treatment, will be given secure login credentials where they alone will be able to access the portal. They would be able to download the IPCC software and worksheets and work on them and populate it with their activity data, and therefore calculate their emissions, perform some preliminary QA/QC checks on it, and then fill out all of the templates that have been designed to accompany the data and upload it into the KMS from the supplier side. From the receiver side, the EMA will then perform secondary QA/QC checks on this and liaise with the stakeholder or the supplier in case there are any discrepancies. And once there's a satisfactory resolution to any uncertainties or challenges, then it will be incorporated towards the greenhouse gas inventory. And as I said, uploaded into a national registry, which we hope will be made public for all to see. To facilitate the data documentation, then, as I alluded to, templates for design, utilizing guidance and examples from various sources, including the UNFCCC, the World Resources Institute guidance protocols on greenhouse gas inventorying, the US EPA templates, documentations that were provided by the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. But notwithstanding the mix of templates, examples that were used, the templates are consistent with UNFCCC and IPCC guidelines for national GHG inventory development. So the templates are not at odds with what is required internationally. As I said, also part of the template design includes a confidentiality agreement, which allows for an agreement between the coordinating entity, the KMS, and the relevant supplier of the data that may include confidential information for the development of that would be necessary for the development of the national greenhouse gas inventory emissions. So that the issue of confidentiality is also addressed within the template system. It includes unit tables for guiding, conversion of activity data of the various different units in which data is collected, primarily to convert that into a form that is compatible with the IPCC guidelines, and so that there is a provision of the conversion tables that will improve the TACCC principles that will ensure use of the data for accurate GHG emission calculations. It also provides for guidance on identifying and key category analysis. That is those sectors that have the largest contribution to the net greenhouse gas emission totals in the country, and a key category analysis tool has been provided to work in conjunction with the IPCC reporting software for use in the KMS. Additionally, there is QA/QC guidelines and documentation that provides a template for the establishment of the national QA/QC program that, of course, aims towards improving the TACCC principles upon which all greenhouse gas inventorying is based. And certainly we want to reach the highest possible standards and the highest possible quality for the greenhouse gas inventories that we are putting together. And that was borne in mind when the MRV and the KMS system was designed. So in that document, there have been checklists included for the coordinators, for sector leads and specific management roles identified within the overall QA/QC procedures. There's also a quality assurance document that helps to verify some of the data and the emissions calculated. And this provides checklists for expert reviewers or chosen personnel not involved in the operational running of the MRV, but also facilitate verification and to as a third-party independent verifier, so that the data can be and the documentation can be readily available to reviewers upon requests. It also includes within that range cross-cutting checks for the national inventory and checklists for the various sectors, the various emitting sectors: energy, industry processes, forestry, land use, and waste. And most importantly, there is also a data archiving system, because as we go from inventory to inventory, and as when you develop an inventory, it's not sort of fossilized, pardon the term, and untouchable. So a comprehensive archiving system is necessary, so that as uncertainty and uncertainties or emission factors are developed to reduce uncertainty, we can go back to previous inventories and tweak them to ensure that a greater level of certainty and a greater level of quality assurance was provided, so that this would allow us for more accurate trend analysis as we go forward. So it provides, in addition to that, it safeguards measures for avoiding the loss of data and information, of course, to improve past inventories as well, and to reproduce and update greenhouse gas estimates, and to facilitate future inventory staff, because we know there will be staff turnover at the EMA, for example, where people leave and come. This is for a long time to come. So it will facilitate future staff to develop subsequent GHG inventories by understanding what has been done before. So the data archiving system has been identified as a critical aspect of the overall MRV KMS system. There's also a methodologies or data documentation that allows or assists the stakeholders that are involved in estimates to report, to document and report relevant activity data sets, emission factors that they may be using if they're not using default factors, and with justifications, and why they may be, and the reasoning for choosing a methodology that might be different from the IPCC 2006 guidelines. But this would also allow, because I know that there are other API methods, for example, or derivatives of those methodologies that some industries use. And so we want to maintain some level of congruence and conformity with what is required internationally through the IPCC 2006 guidelines. So this would allow future inventory teams to access what methods were chosen, so that there is a comparison of consistency, how the emission factors were obtained, which ones were used, if there were specific ones that were developed, how they were developed, and so on, and how information relevant to the inventory was obtained. So you have this sort of chain of custody kind of documentation that also contributes to enhanced quality assurance and quality control checks. Once the MRV KMS system was designed, we pilot tested it with data suppliers. if they are here, let me thank them in their absence. If they are not here, for participating voluntarily in this pilot project. And this was basically instituted to test the operationality of the MRV and the KMS system, to identify gaps in the user friendliness, for example, of it. And those have been identified, and the system has been tweaked and toggled to improve usability of the system. So we are now on to the next steps. This is just an example of the KMS interfaces that you would see when you log on, when a stakeholder logs on to the system. And for as far as our current and next steps go, while our NDC looks primarily at 3 sectors on a business as usual baseline, they have also developed BAUs for the other sectors, the other emitting sectors, which is the agriculture, forestry, and land use and waste. And we have now embarked on training in these sectors to fill identified gaps in the data collection, quality assurance, and quality control aspects of it. Because these are the sectors, particularly the AFLU sector, the forestry and land use, is fraught with uncertainties in terms of the types of data that are collected, the integrity of the data, the quality of the data, and so on. So we are trying to fill those gaps and build further capacity to tighten up quality assurance and quality confidence of the data. We are in the process of developing and designing, or rather tweaking, the MRV system to incorporate the modalities, procedures, and guidelines that have been adopted under Article 18 of the Paris Agreement, as I had alluded to, or the Enhanced Transparency Framework, so that we come up to speed and we ensure compliance and compatibility with what is now required under the Paris Agreement. We are also trying to develop an adaptation component of the MRV KMS that would see the submission of data and information from various sectors that will facilitate the compilation of adaptation reporting that is now required under the Paris Agreement. As well, we are in the process of training in using the MRV data to apply to development or the construction of business as usual baselines to assess compliance and as well tracking of the NDCs, with the specific aim of bringing the MRV system and the BAU construction skills together, with the ultimate aim of developing economy-wide targets for future NDCs to take into consideration all of the issues related to emissions, whether they come from the AFLU waste industry and some of the other sectors that emit greenhouse gases, such as to be in coherence with and in compliance with the Kigali amendments, for example, because we now have to look at HFCs. We have critically examined the MRV system and the KMS system in terms of formalizing this in a legal and institutional way. And we are on the way to amending, the amendments have already begun to be drafted to incorporate this regulation into the existing legislation, specifically the air pollution rules under the Environmental Management Act, that will allow for mandatory data reporting and mitigation actions. And again, this is really the first step to ensure that we have accurate inventorying and quality data before we can actually manage it. We've heard repeatedly that we can't manage what we can't measure. So this is the first step in measuring it. With the overall intention of full integration of this MRV system into the overall environmental governance framework of the country. I just wanted to add that in terms of the NDC, I don't think I have it on a slide, but it has now come as an afterthought, I guess. I don't have it on a slide, but just to say that in terms of implementing the NDC, we have also developed an NDC implementation plan There is now an interministerial committee and a technical committee that has oversight for implementing the plan, and as well developed a financial investment plan that seeks to leverage finance for implementing the NDC in terms of the unconditional component. As you know, the estimated cost of full implementation of the NDC and full achievement is $2 billion US. And so the financial investment plan will seek to see how that financing can be leveraged domestically, public-private partnerships through multilateral access and so on. But critically to add that the transportation sector, the transportation component of the NDC already includes maritime. There is no specific reference to maritime emissions or for domestic maritime emissions, but it is understood to be within the transportation emissions. And it's in fact in the implementation plan and in the carbon reduction strategy, there are actions identified specifically for the maritime sector for domestic emissions, such as fuel switching, for example, going to LPG was one of the considerations. But let me, in addition to all of this, we are hoping to create redundancy capacity and capability within all institutions, primarily the EME and everywhere else who wants it, by developing on-demand online training that is in the process now, so that anyone who wants to look at, to be trained in the MRV, in the KMS, and the IPCC guidelines and so on, and using the templates can go online, so that you don't have to, plan a separate face-to-face training, in these challenging times. This would be useful so that new staff, for example, or newly deployed staff or redeployed staff that may be required in various agencies to now take on responsibility for doing inventorying can go online and can access some of the training and therefore build that kind of what I call redundancy capacity and capability. We again formalizing it legally, but in addition to that, we are we're in the process of developing a certification program with GSGMI and UNFCCC and UTT and UWI and DTO and many others, many stakeholders. The objective of the certification program is to provide a certain level of competency and certification for stakeholders or data suppliers who will be supplying data to the KMS, in addition to those receiving the data. Because if the EM Act has provisions for recourse in an environmental court in case there is any discrepancy, and the Environmental Commission, of course, would have to look at competency requirements. In addition, part of the proposal for incorporating into the air pollution rules would be a stipulation that anyone who is doing any greenhouse gas inventory has to meet a certain minimum level of competency, and we hope that the certification program can provide that level of competency. And of course, once all of these are put in place and the amendment is there, that there will be a national rollout, and then this becomes a routine issue for reporting, for monitoring, and for verification. Let me close by just saying that I'm very encouraged to hear the efforts of the MTCC and the UTT and the work that they are doing. This is the kind of work that we are looking for and looking forward to cooperating to enhance the overall quality of emissions to get to the highest tier possible, so that we can disaggregate as far as possible where the emissions are coming from, because only in this way we can actually identify what mitigation and intervention measures are needed and where they are needed to maximize every opportunity for reducing emissions where they occur everywhere. So I leave by saying thank you. This is my humble offering, but I also want to recognize for some content and format Ryan Deosaran, who had put together some of the slides and information for a previous presentation. So I say thank you to him for that and acknowledge his contribution. So with that, I say thank you very much. And I suppose I'll be open for any questions that I'm sure will be coming forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar Singh, for sharing your insightful and informative presentation, giving us that thorough understanding of the MRV system, in particular to Trinidad and Tobago's nationally determined contributions. At this point in time, we'll be moving to our panel discussion segment. And I know that we do have a couple questions and discussions taking place in our chat. We do thank all those who have been involved in those discussions. I'm trusting my team to respond to individual concerns that are being uploaded there. If there's anyone who would like to reiterate any question or seek any further clarification to an answer which was provided, I'm asking you to please do so now in our panel discussion. Not all at once? No? Please note as well, if you have any further questions or concerns, you can feel free to reach out to us even after the session as well. I will go back to one of the questions which was posed in the chat to the Maritime administrations. The representatives that we do have here, we're asking what challenges do you foresee in assessing the reliable data for fuels used for domestic maritime activities? We were asking if it is that you could share any information that you may have on this process with us. I know that Darlene has been giving us some information on behalf of Belize. I know we do have a couple other maritime administrations represented here. Is it possible that we may get some insight?
Chair, Carlos Fuller here. I don't have any insights on that, but just some more, another bit of information that maybe could address some of what Stefan talked about the timeline.
Sure, Mr. Fuller.
Yes, so next year we should be implementing a major project funded by the government of Germany on the implementation of NDCs in CARICOM member states in the energy and transport sector. And there are going to be a few flagships, 4 of them, and in particular in Guyana, it's going to look at maritime transport. So I thought, since it's going to be specific about policies, but also actually putting in a concrete 1 or 2 vessels that will actually then see how they work. I think maybe it would be good to gather the baseline prior to the launching the vessels and then seeing what is the result. Because based on that, then we could then actually then develop a full-fledged project with the CDB to actually then deploy it across the Caribbean and use that as an example. So I just thought that could then inform your timeline going into the next couple of years. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Mr. Fuller. Right, and yes, these projects are the projects that we want to focus on. Right, we know that the data is an issue, just as you said, the baseline information, collecting the data, showing that such projects are viable. Right, that is something that is the assistance that we need from the administrations and the fuel providers. Right, in helping us to do it. It will also help if the specific reduction targets are included in the NDCs for countries like Guyana. If we have to focus well, not focus, but to invest in trying to attract this or receive this funding, right? It is, we have, over the past, what we have found or encountered is that once they are not within the NDCs, it becomes a bit more difficult in attracting the funding for the projects. So that is why we are trying to encourage the countries as much as possible to have the maritime specific reduction targets included in it, right? So when these opportunities do arise, we have a starting point that has already been started, and we could show that, yes, we may be able to implement such projects.
Okay, thank you for that, Stefan and Mr. Fuller. Again, if we have any other questions coming forward, what I would like to pose to Mr. Kumar Singh and Mr. Fuller again, what is required from the maritime authorities in the drive to have the sector do its part in getting the maritime emission reduction targets included in the respective nations' NDCs. And this is to assist with the maritime administrations who are not posing the questions at the moment.
Well, from the regional level, I believe the issue is, as was mentioned before, when we do our greenhouse gas inventories, we tend to do it at a very top level approach. And I do believe that would be an opportunity now as countries work on their next national communications or their BURs, that some of that project funding is used to actually do specific data gathering in the maritime section, whether it's, you monitor one port, water taxes or something in particular in a country doing their inventory. We could actually then segment that, that information, because usually energy, the whole transport is lumped together with electricity generation, and you just see one figure and we are not breaking it down to the subsectors.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you, Carlos, for setting the stage for my answer. I guess well, as I said, the maritime emissions or emissions from maritime transport is already included in the NDC. It's not specifically referenced as maritime emissions, but it's referenced as transportation emissions. And the implementation plan, the carbon reduction strategy, suite of actions speak, if you look at that, specific reference to maritime emissions for domestic transport. What I think, and as I alluded to in the closing comments of my presentation, what I am encouraged by is the tremendous amount of work that Captain Singh and Mr. Nannan is doing in terms of disaggregating the baseline in the maritime sector that will now allow us to identify opportunities for reducing emissions of different technologies, for example, whether it's fuel, more efficient engines, different fuels. I'm particularly taken by the electric ferry example that was provided as part of the pilot in Germany. So I think what needs to happen is to disaggregate as far as possible, or to do an emissions audit, if you want, as far as possible in maritime operations that will identify areas where there is opportunity for reducing the emissions, whether it's a change in practice, whether it's a change in technology or change in equipment, or whatever it is. I think that is where the value really lies, and this is not only unique for the maritime sector. This is really for applicable to industry and in fact everywhere we get greenhouse gas emissions. But I also take note of next week's seminar that seeks to look at ways of decarbonizing. So I think that would be very interesting, because it seems that there would be some already identified mitigation options for the maritime sector. But for us here in Trinidad and Tobago, I look forward to working with the MTCC and UTT in this emerging and exciting aspect of the greenhouse gas inventory framework. So again, you'll be hearing a lot from me, maybe first rather than you contacting me, as I have always nabbed you before. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the responses. So I want to thank everyone for the questions and the answers, the discussions provided. In the essence of time, I would like to give our panelists 30 seconds to summarize some of the key points that they would like to leave with our audience. I know that Mr. Kumar Singh has been actually, preluding to that, explaining what it is that we could probably be working together with MTCC Caribbean. So I would still like to give the panelists, I wanted to start with our guest speakers, Mr. Fuller and then Mr. Kumar Singh, and then with our MTCC representatives, Captain Singh and Mr. Nannan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My closing remarks would just be that indeed we are now at the stage where we are now preparing the implementation plans of the NDCs. So while we have stated, for example, transport comes across virtually every NDC in the Caribbean, but we have not broken them down. Okay, what exactly do you want to do in the transport sector? Is it public transport? Is it maritime? I think that is where that implementation plan would then identify how we would then address the marine transport, and we could then indeed come up with the timelines that Stefan has shared with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kumar Singh, if you have any further.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. We are fairly advanced in terms of measuring, reporting, and verifying our emissions in terms of the institutional setups for the KMS. And I refer to the two sort of headline statements that were made. You can't manage what you can't measure, and accurate inventorying is the first step. So the MRV KMS system is the first step. We have not done this before. This is all new terrain for us, and we look forward to getting the data and the information. It's all voluntary at this stage, and so we look forward to MTCC and UTT participating in the in submitting data to the MRV KMS system. This will test the level of disaggregation that they are doing now, and also further tweak the system to accommodate maritime emissions going forward as we build future inventories and NDCs. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm next, Suzette. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Suzette, and thank you, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank all the participants. Now, capturing on the essence, I think I will not go technical in capturing. I will be a little philosophical here. Why? The reason is because I think we are on the right path, but at the same time, we see these challenges which impact the inventories or other aspects of ambitions or anything. But we need to look at little philosophically that there may be 100 challenges in what we want to achieve. But at the same time, this is our experience at MTCC in last 4 years that if there are 100 challenges, there are 100 solutions also. And we have within this participation here, we have members who have been associated with us who are through their personal championship, I would say, they are personal champions who have been assisting us in collecting this data or trying to do everything correct to provide substance to whatever we are doing. So we need to continue on the same path, and we can achieve. I mean, these timelines, let this timeline not intimidate us, right? We can achieve these things because even if there are various other challenges, organizational, we operating in silos, there is no data management system working in a proper way, but we know there are ways how we can make it work. So I would just summarize it that all we need is trust among each other and the sharing of data, what exists, and look at the common goal rather than individual perspective. So that's what I would say. Thank you so much.
And Stefan?
Okay, first, I would like to thank all the participants and the presenters today. Thank you for taking the time to stay with us, right, for the 2 hours. I am also observing the discussions on the chat, right? It was basically, as Stefan said, a whole other webinar on its side, right, which shows the interest in the topic. What I want to add is, we all know the goals of the Paris Agreement. We all have an idea of the gap that is there. And it is our humanitarian responsibility, regardless of which sector we operate in, to make all efforts to reduce the GHG emissions. I think it is time that the maritime sector sells itself, right? Let it be known what contributions will come from the maritime sector. It will require a lot of cooperation among the sector because data is not normally easy to get out of it. That is the first part. So we look forward to the cooperation of the Caribbean maritime sector on the whole and the stakeholders within the Caribbean, right, to help us to achieve in this goal. And again, it's everybody's responsibility. And it is time we all operate in the maritime sector to sell the maritime sector and show what it could do and what it could contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. At this moment, I just wanted to ask for you guys to put on your camera so we can have that group picture that we spoke about in the beginning.
That's everybody.
Okay, just for a couple people to put on their cameras first. Okay, thank you guys. So now that we've come to the end of an informative and productive webinar session, I would like to thank the speakers for making this exchange of knowledge possible, for sharing their expertise with us. I would like to especially acknowledge the participants as well for taking the time to share in our discussions. And last but not least, I would like to thank those of you who provided the necessary data and the information to make these presentations possible, especially our energy focal points within respective countries and our stakeholders within the maritime sector. So we encourage each and every one of you to tune in with us next week, same day, same time, for a concluding webinar Wednesday session, where our panel of experts will be discussing the various pathways to decarbonizing the maritime sector. So stay safe, everyone. Thank you very much, and see you next week.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.